Sometimes the founders are just not aggressive enough. They don't have a big enough ambition. They don't have that bit between their teeth to go and take this opportunity to the sun. And frankly, a lot of people don't understand, that can get you through some pretty tough times. If you've got that sort of relationship where you can be honest with each other, where you can tell each other everything that's bad about what's happening, what you're trying to achieve. So there was a $228 credit card purchase. We were sitting in the WeWork in Sydney and 9 a.m. in the morning, and we just all got up off our desks and walked straight downstairs to the beer pump, and we had our first beer, right? Excited to have someone just buy our product. It was just, the feeling was just, I can't even explain it. It was just, you couldn't argue that we were the best at everything. That's not true. What we happened to get very lucky in is that our market timing for this particular problem was absolutely perfect. Again, I think we all weren't too greedy because we all needed to come together and make that decision. Because if you get greedy, you can miss the window, right? Honestly, I wanted a break from the day-to-day grind. It's super stressful. And again, I might have a lot of energy, but my energy reserves were gone, right? So I needed a place to rebuild that energy reserves, but stay sharp and stay focused.
Today's show is with possibly one of the highest energy people that I've ever met in my life, Keith Davison. He's a tech guy. He's been through a couple of startup journeys. His first notable success was taking a company from 0 to 6 million recurring revenue in 2.5 years and then selling the company for $120 million. So that's 2.5 years to $120 million exit. This story is jam-packed with insights on how to start, grow, and run, and then exit a successful company. It applies as much to outside of tech as it does inside. We talk about investing, we talk about raising money, we talk about founder realities today. This is an amazing conversation. Please enjoy. Keith Davison, great to have you on the show. Welcome
Thank
today.
Thank you very much for having me, Josh.
What a pleasure.
Yes.
Hey, so after you sold your first company, you shared on LinkedIn that you'd actually failed in your first 5 endeavors, and then you went to $100 million exit.
That's correct.
That's quite the turnaround.
That is quite the turnaround, yes.
Yeah. So those failures, we always learn more from the things that we don't succeed at than those that we do. So what lessons did you take away from those that you brought to your successful first venture?
Yeah, good question. I'll go back a little bit to just a little bit about each one of those and the rough timeline. So I've tried to start 7 companies in total. And obviously, as you've rightly researched, the first 5 were a dismal failure for a variety of different reasons. I think sometimes with those side hustles, you have this ambition to be this person, but it's very hard to leave your corporate job to go and pursue that full time. I'd say that's probably one of the hardest things, is to be willing to take a real leap of faith. There's a lot of risk involved with leaving, obviously a job that's very important for your everyday survival in terms of cash flow, and go and chase something that's completely unproven, right? So most of them would have failed in that, what you would call that trying to find problem solution fit, right? So has there a problem in the market that's worth solving? You'd end up working on something for 6 months and, you probably pick it apart in terms of this is too hard. I'm not kind of getting the signals that I need. Something changes in your everyday life that makes it too difficult to commit to that opportunity. Maybe the people you're partnering up with on this side hustle don't have the same conviction. So stars really need to align in order to get these businesses off the ground. So I think probably the biggest takeaway for me on those 5 was maybe even the timing in my life might have not been perfect, in the sense that I was still young, but I hadn't matured that entrepreneurial side of my brain. And in fact, so this was in Sydney, by the way. I was in Sydney from 2012 to 2019. The venture market then was still relatively young, right? And obviously I think New Zealand was the same. And so there wasn't this massive ecosystem that you see today of founders getting together at all these events with all these VCs, essentially helping you navigate this journey. It was pretty raw, right? I don't even remember there being any sort of communities whatsoever to support you on this. We just kind of were, a bunch of friends together trying to work it out. We had that appetite, we had that ambition, we had a vision on what we thought we could become, but ultimately they just kept falling apart, right? And I think it's just because none of this infrastructure was there. There was I didn't even know how to raise money back then. It was a thing that wasn't as well documented, as well known as it is now. And then obviously I probably deep down didn't have enough conviction that maybe was I even the right person to go and see some of these ideas through, right? You don't have a right as a founder to win, right? Sometimes you have there's a little bit more evidence to suggest you're a good person to go and solve that particular issue. But yeah, in your early 20s, it's just a lot of discovery you're doing on yourself. So I actually my biggest thing would be I don't think I was actually ready to see something fully through from start to finish. And I probably wasn't ready to put my cushy job on the line for a side project that we've been doing in a house that didn't really have any meaningful legs. And by the way, we had no meaningful way to fund these things back then either.
Yeah.
So I just think, or a combination of all those things basically meant these things never really got off the ground, right? But we'd spend 6 to 9 months on them. So it's not like there was an attempt. We incorporated businesses. We tried to go and meet customers. We tried to meet partners. So yeah, there was a lot of learning, but I think it was really growing up as for myself that got me to ready for when we did actually build the real thing.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
So my belief is that the idea is number 4, number 5 in terms of importance in the likelihood of that venture succeeding. Put that aside for a second and we'll come back to that conversation. But if you look back upon those 5 ventures that didn't succeed and with the capability set with the age and stage that you're at now, do you think that you could have made one of those things work if you were to start it now?
Yes and no. So once you have kind of got all the battle wounds, I think there's a lot of things that you would shortcut, right? So there's things that I was doing 10 years ago that would just, if I think about them now, it's just ridiculous, right? Like there's a certain way and a blueprint to actually starting a company, with just the ideation and getting those like early prototypes to market. Like a lot of that I didn't know, right? I think maybe that's, as I talk to you, it just didn't really exist, right? Today, if you were to start something, even let's pretend I was me 10 years ago today, the amount of artifacts and documentation and YouTube videos and ecosystems in each of these cities are night and day from where they were in 2012, right? So I do think if I were to go back and start one of these ideas again, I would do it differently, right? And only because of the knowledge I now have. I would argue I had no knowledge. That's probably one of the things that held me back. I'm not saying there aren't founders out there today that are students trying to build companies, but obviously they're able to go and learn so much now before they even take a leap of faith like this. So I remember even with one of the ideas that I was building, it was in the sort of sales and marketing tech space. Again, this was probably 2013, 2014. I spent like $70,000, $80,000 of my hard-earned savings to like prototype a product. Like I built like a whole product before I'd even pretty much spoken to anyone in the market, right? So you could argue there was a bit of naivety there, but just these mistakes that you make along the way that ultimately break your conviction in whatever idea you're doing. And so it's really challenging, right? I think now, and again, any of the content that you're hearing, from founders or well-documented VCs and podcasts, it's really, I don't want to say easy, but it is quite easy to go build something, prototype something really cheap and just go and validate it with a bunch of potential end user prospects or business prospects and just de-risk the whole opportunity. None of that really existed when I was trying to do this. So.
Mm-hmm. The other interesting duality about that is that, yes, you can get something out of the ground cheaper, you can raise money faster, and there's more sources for that capital.
Absolutely.
There's a quicker ability to test ideas out in market. You can add probably 3 to 5 things more to that list that it's kind of better now than it was 15 years ago. The flip side of that coin is now that there are hundreds of companies that are competing for that same minute,
I was going to bring this up,
tiny little niche of the market. So let's talk about kind of how the startup space has evolved and like some other things, some other changes.
It's honestly crazy, right? So like, as you said there, you could argue that it would have been better for me to try and launch something in 2012 because there was probably very few people actually trying to do that, right? That's why the market didn't exist. There wasn't really any early, obviously there's some well-known VCs that were around, but this was a very small part of the market ecosystem. There wasn't a lot of founders to talk to. You didn't know where these founders hung out. What were you meant to be reading? There was no extensive materials online. Yes, there were bits and bobs, but now, okay, well, the barrier to entry for anyone out the street, a student, someone later in their career, there is no barrier to entry, right? We were obviously having a conversation before this where it's, really starting a business today is drastically de-risked compared to where we were maybe 10 years ago. So I do think there's a lot to unpack there, but certainly today, I think there is almost no barrier to entry to go start a company. The biggest barrier is whatever idea you've got, probably 1,000 other people have as well. So I'd actually argue that I would have probably liked to have executed better 10 years ago because now you're up against absolutely everybody who has roughly the same idea. So that's a real challenge.
The other advent, of course, over the last couple of years is the large language models and the incredible magic that we're calling AI. Both been around for long enough to know that it is literally magic, and most people are merely scratching the surface of that thing. And one of the hypotheses around investment for me is that if you look at the S&P 500, the top 7 make up the same as the next 493. They're the fabulous 7, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, etc. We all know those numbers. But of those companies, only 2 existed 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of them are like 12 years old,
Yep.
right? And so if you play that out over time, that's going to extend its way into the future, that there's going to be a very small amount of incredibly big, incredibly powerful companies.
Yeah, I've got probably quite a bit to say on this. I'd love to at least have a conversation with you about this.
Yeah.
So I think, obviously, in America, one of the things that makes them so strong at innovating and so strong at building these sort of companies that we all aspire to build is the existential risk that exists in that market, right? So let me just explain that. So I've been in the US a lot over the last 10 years and lived there for 18 months and still operate there today. So had a lot of experience. It's cutthroat. There's competition everywhere, right? So the challenge that you have in the US is you cannot afford to not innovate your way to success. So what happens is typically, and again, if we take that example that you just referenced about companies on the stock market, is the ones that don't innovate and don't move with speed and don't modernize and don't look to new technologies and look to new ways to do things and reinvent themselves will not be around in 10 years. Now, again, I'm no expert on that that topic in general, but if you bring it out to the Australian, New Zealand market, that doesn't really exist. Sure, you could argue it in a few niche cases, but there isn't like this existential risk that exists for companies in these markets, right? So what you end up with is what I like to call the innovators. They're just like, it's essentially innovation theater, right? So these companies talk about innovation and this is how they attract good talent and how they're embracing AI and building new technologies. But the reality is those projects are very quick to lose their funding because at the end of the day, they have these massive moats because of a lack of competition in the market that can even remotely try and challenge them for that. So I think it's really interesting because you just don't feel that out here where there's this, in the business community, you don't feel like tomorrow I could go to business if I don't spend an extra dollar to go and innovate my way out of this hole. So even in our current business, the only way, we're in a hyper competitive battle in a very competitive global market in the cybersecurity market. It is all about speed and innovation. That is it. There is no other survival strategy that we have, right? So I think it's a really interesting comment because I think what you'll see is in 10 years, a lot of those companies will be gone.
Yeah.
And they're already showing signs of dying. Anyway, so this topic is really interesting because often as I speak to business buyers, very few companies are on the front foot right now. What I mean by that is everybody's kind of in survival mode. Everybody's trying to cut costs. Everybody's consolidating their vendors. Everybody's going back to their core business. What that means is no one's really on the front foot innovating on new projects and new ideas because it's too risky, too expensive, and too unknown. That's the challenge. And they don't need to do it. But in America, they have to.
Yeah.
So really interesting conversation, this.
I think that I work with both tech companies, not startups, but later stage, those that are getting themselves ready for sale typically, but also some general old school businesses, services companies typically. And the conversation that I'm having with them is around what they're doing. We always have a pillar around automation or artificial intelligence, keeping themselves ahead of where things are at. And some of them are saying, well, I don't believe that our customers any stage soon are going to replace what we're doing with AI. And my commentary to them is, you're not going to get beaten by your customers. You're going to get beaten by the 2 high school dropouts that are sitting at their parents' home, that have got zero expenses, that are digitally native, that have been using these tools since they came out. They've lived and breathed large language models, and they'll build a business model which will replicate yours. It'll cost them 1/10 to deliver that. They'll sell it for 1/3, maybe 75% of what you're selling.
They'll do it in 2 weeks.
They'll do it in 2 weeks. That's the risk to your business. Do you have a view on that hypothesis?
I mean, I probably do. I wouldn't be the foremost expert on it, but I'll definitely talk about some of my experiences. So just for a little bit of context, our current business is in the cloud security space. So for those that are listening, basically companies that are running their businesses on AWS and Microsoft Azure, folks would have heard of those platforms. We provide a third-party security and compliance product to help them feel the trust and safety and scaling in those environments. We are in a position where it is now in the software vendor community, it is table stakes to be able to bring AI capabilities to your customers. Now, if you are not providing that, you're already not at the table, right? So point number one is customers are expecting you to bring this innovation to them. If you think about how most of, certainly the companies that I'm talking to in the ANZ market, even in the US, are relying on their incumbent vendors to bring this innovation to them, it's a lot more risky for someone to stand up an internal AI project, right? And so, well, they do it, but at the moment, based on the data I have from speaking to a lot of people in the field, is it's still very much at like POC stage.
Yeah.
Right? People are like, yes, they're spending money on it. Yes, they're investing in OpenAI and those and the likes. But like, really, what they're expecting is every one of their vendors is bringing AI innovation to them through their current SaaS applications, right? So that the experience I'm having is without an AI story, I'm already behind, right? So if you think about all those vendors and folks on the stock market you're referencing, yep, they're talking a lot about AI in their marketing materials, right? But where rubber hits the road is in what are the use cases and what are the problems that you're solving with AI that are fundamentally changing how I'm running my business. So that is what we are trying to do, right? Is ultimately trying to help companies make doing security work much, much easier because of the innovation that is AI, right? So I think it's just super interesting what you're talking about. And then if you think about where are disruption vectors is, so again, if you look at, and this will be near to your heart, I assume as well, is the YC call for companies this year. So YC, for those that don't know, is the large, startup incubator in Silicon Valley, very well known for a host of different reasons. But their request for startups, I had a look at it and the second one on there was AI companies for compliance and security. Okay, super interesting, right? So what this means is there's an expectation from, a bunch of very smart people that this is an area that is going to get disrupted by AI. Okay, now if I don't invest in this, what's going to happen to my business in a year or two? Am I even in the game? Probably not, right? So it's directly impacted the way we think about our business. It's not a nice to have, it is a must have. And actually going to execute on this is really hard. It's not all of a sudden you just repurpose a couple of engineers and like all of a sudden you're like an AI guru shop. Like it doesn't work like that.
No.
We are anyway. So it's a super interesting piece of advice you're giving those customers because it's real.
Yeah.
Yep.
The other thing for me is with my investor hat on is that I'm getting pitched things daily, as probably you are as well. And so if people are talking to me about an AI platform play, I'm actually not interested. I'll tell you why. 21, 22, 23, and I think 24, most of the money, like more than half of the money out of the States and Europe was going into AI platform plays. If you go looking for an AI platform play to help you determine how much liquid to put into a glass is the optimal amount, it will exist. If you go looking for one to tell you where to place microphones, it'll exist. So there's an AI platform play that's being built for almost everything.
Correct.
And there's probably 10 that are sitting in that marketplace. And this is where it gets interesting because if you look at how markets play out over time, is that people always niche and they go into adjacent markets. That's the classic, go-to-market model these days.
Yep.
And so the well-funded will be the ones that will win. There's always one dominant player in a market, and then you end up with people that own little niches underneath that. Dominant one tends to be 3 to 10 times the value of any of those smaller ones. And so each of these spaces has between 5 and 50 companies that are building platforms to try and win in there. And so I'm not interested in funding any of these things because I think of it like a 400-meter race. It's longer than that, but just for the visual sakes. And so if you're coming out of the starting gate now, these people are already around the first bend and they're halfway along the first straight, right? Because they're 2 to 3 years in front of you. They've got 20, 50, $100 million, $500 million checks. And so they're far, far better resourced. They've already got some customers in market and they will have hit product market fit already. And so for anyone that doesn't have an AI subscription as in a newsletter subscription, get one today because you need to be aware of these things that are coming out because they're literally coming out by the dozens every single day. And so the space has proliferated. It's exciting, but it's also like I'm sitting there with the box of popcorn going, who's going to win this race?
And how do you pick the winners? Right? Like how? It is so difficult. And the other thing that, just to build on that is, everybody's talking about the same companies right now in the space in a variety of different sectors. They get a lot of the, the LinkedIn headlines today. I'm sure we all know who those are. they might not be around in 6 months, right? So like they might be doing record numbers at the moment and record growth and all these sort of amazing statistics. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out over the next 2 to 5 years. I can talk about this. Everything you said there really resonates. So in our current market category, the winner in that category was a company called Wiz that just got acquired by Google for $32 billion. So again, just to put that in perspective, it was like 40 or 50x revenue.
Wow.
That is playing directly to the market definition that you just referenced, right?
Yeah.
So it is very real. And what ends up happening is the other players in the market do look for those niches where maybe that player isn't present or isn't serving correctly. And again, there's a huge market there for everybody to participate. But you're right, it does tend to be a big winner that tends to run away with that category. But what we see now is those categories reinvent themselves again. So I would suggest, if I can take it back to a world I understand maybe a little better, which is the cloud security world, is I actually think in our world, and I think you can take this to other industries, is we're kind of entering in our industry a third or fourth chapter of this topic, right? And why? Because of AI, right? So all of a sudden, the tooling, the way you solve problems, the way you do things to actually get the work done in this particular space is reinventing itself again. What does that mean? New opportunities and new winners come to life, right? Because you could argue a winner has now been not removed from the market, but certainly has their trajectory is going to shift given their acquisition by Google, probably very positively, by the way. But that means that I think almost every category is going to get disrupted. Like every single one is going to be whatever player you think is there today. It's not that name in 3 years, right? And maybe sooner, probably 12 months. And so also you got to think about the pressure on, well, two areas where there's a lot of pressure. One is these AI companies are raising a lot of money, right? So really what does that mean at the operator level is the expectations are through the roof, right? So if you raise 50, 100, 500 million, you don't have time to waste, right? So you either crash and burn, of which there are many stories about that, or you happen to be the one we read about. Like, that's it. Like, those are the two variables. And I think the graveyard for people's education out there is much bigger than you think.
Yeah.
There is a huge graveyard of failures in the AI space today. We only read about 10.
Yeah.
So let me assure you that the graveyard is significant.
Yeah.
And the idea is to not get in that graveyard. That's
Of
kind of
course.
where we all are as operators, is like, okay, well, how do I navigate this? It is really turbulent at the moment to try and navigate how to build a very successful company. The dynamics and the expectations are changing every day.
Yeah.
So again, I think if you talk about compared to 10 years ago, it's really crazy at the moment. And there is so much money going into this. It's frankly
actually
scary.
expanding. Yeah, I totally agree.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Speaking of graveyards, I was part of a closed-door Chatham House situation,
Yeah.
so I won't mention any specifics, but rather generics. And it was chairs and directors of startup companies.
Yeah.
And so we were sharing ideas, talking about war stories. There was a couple of quite high-profile failures that we were kind of main subject of.
Local ones that you were just like, we're talking about local companies, yeah.
Local companies that have gone global. Mm-hmm. And so one of the bits of commentary was that people were treading around the subject of companies that have gotten themselves out of the ground, maybe to 1 or 2 million revenue, but they've dropped down to 10 to 15% growth, or they're just flatlining growth. We call them zombies, right? The Walking Dead. And so people are treading around the subject. And I said, guys, look, I've just got to call this out, because I think what I'm hearing, and this is certainly something that I believe, is that we are not quick enough to put a zombie down in New Zealand. We will let a startup continue to limp its way along for 3, 5, 8, 10 years. I think in the States, they might be too quick to put a bullet in its head because there's all these stories of many, many companies in New Zealand and offshore, the same is true, where they've had a moment where they're just about to die, but they've managed to get themselves through that moment. So it's really hard to know what the right thing to do is when you're faced with that existential risk. But I do think that we hold on to startups too long in New Zealand.
I think, and I don't have a crystal ball thing here, but this definitely resonates, right? I think this is, I mean, obviously every situation is different, but the other thing I would say, and I would include the Aussie market in this as well, but certainly in New Zealand is, I think both are true. Sometimes the founders are just not aggressive enough, right? They don't have a big enough ambition. They don't have that bit between their teeth to go and take this opportunity to the sun. And frankly, a lot of people don't understand how venture works, right? So like venture is not about trundling along, growing at a modest rate. Like ultimately you are there to grow as fast as possible, probably as aggressively as possible. And honestly, the only way to do that is to get out and, go offshore really quickly. So I do think with these zombie companies you reference is ultimately it's going to come down to like, what is the market opportunity, right? Is the market opportunity such that this is it's at 1 million and it's because the operators or maybe the technology, the way they're taking it to market just isn't appropriate for this category? Like, I think there'll be such a host of questions there, but I think those companies are super interesting for reinvention, right? I'm sure you probably see that as an opportunity as well. I'm sure there's 1 million operators trying to do AI roll-ups right now, take these companies, repackage them up, rebuild them, take that customer base into a new like AI-driven platform play. And I agree. Like, I think there needs to be faster decisions about whether this is worth investing in or not. Well, I mean, what are you seeing and what are the reasons to keep it alive right now? Like, why would you keep a zombie company going at 10% at $1 million a year? They're not going to get the exit returns.
Yeah.
They definitely won't. I mean, you could argue that if the founder has a ton of equity,
typically,
of course.
Yeah, by then
they've diluted all the way down, right? So like, what is the point, right? So why would they keep it alive?
Yeah, two reasons. Hope. Hope is not a strategy, but we tend to pin a lot of hope to something.
Yep.
Then the thing that sits in behind that is that we like the person and we like the idea, and we just kind of the next step, the next change is going to get them across the line. The next bit of investment is going to be the thing that gets them across the line. The other one, and I think this is probably the dominating mental model that sits here, is sunk cost bias.
Oh, yes.
So we've spent 5 years on this idea. We've invested $8 million, right, in this thing. And so
what's another million?
Yeah.
Exactly. What's another million to give it a shot at hope, right?
The best thing that I've now come across, it's something that I've adopted over time, is that every time I'm asked for a check for something, I go, will I invest today, regardless of whether I've got 5, 10, 100, 300 sitting on this thing right now, would I invest today based upon the metrics that this company's achieving, the growth that they've had over time up until this point in time, and what their roadmap looks like into the future?
So you would remove, like, essentially all that goodwill from that decision, right? 100%. And like, because that's the hard part, is all goodwill, right?
It's
like
so hard.
The person, the individual, the journey, and there's a lot there. So I understand that. So you're trying to say strip that out and just make a business decision, right? Because like, again, I think I think founders could do a better job of thinking this way as well, right? It's like, okay, well, I'm asking Josh for $1 million to keep my company alive. Why? What's my ROI on $1 million? Like, if I'm not getting a return, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
Right. So I do think that's really important, and it's not easy. I'm sure it's not easy to actually do that.
Because all these biases that are running around in my system.
Of course, because you want this founder to do well.
Of course
you do.
Yeah, especially if you've been supporting them along the way.
Of course. What do you think is going to play out here? But do you think there's like, how do you see it evolving?
Really
it's not
hard to say. It's really hard to say. I'll tell you what I'm interested in at the moment. And so we've been talking about software plays to date. There's a new class of VCs that are starting up, and I've come across a couple in New Zealand and a number offshore, which are taking the AI automation lens to traditional businesses. So they're buying largely baby boomer founder businesses that haven't managed to get their succession planning working properly. And so the kids haven't picked it up, or they've tried to sell it, or they haven't been able to, whatever it might be. And so they're buying these businesses for a reasonable valuation and then bringing automation to the table, so stripping all the cost out of it, and so reducing the cost base by 30, 50, 70%, and then turning it into a profit-making machine, not asset stripping, because that's a different model back in the 80s, the greed is good, Gordon Gekko kind of mindset, different to that, but rather than modernizing these historic businesses that fix machinery or install flooring or put plumbing in and turning them into profit machines. That's a really interesting space to me.
Yeah, and so quite interestingly, I'm part of a Discord group with about 2,500 exited founders across the world, mainly US and Israeli.
EFP?
Yeah, I remember talking to you about it. This is a huge topic in that group, right? So what tends to happen when someone exits their business is they tend to get a little bit lost for a little bit, right? So they have
loss of identity.
Of course. Yeah. So their whole identity is wrapped up in these businesses they built. I get it. I understand it. And they tend to go and look for a host of different opportunities to just kind of see what they can do next, to have a little bit of purpose, a little bit of focus. One of them that it's a red hot topic globally is this, right? I actually have a bunch of friends in the market today across both countries that are very aggressively looking at this opportunity. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's tens of thousands of companies, possibly, that fit this mold, both software and non-software businesses. That this is my whole point. I just think this obviously AI is real, right? There's no, I think, if anyone who thinks it isn't, I think it's disrupting the 100-year business that maybe just needs new systems and technology to drive a better profit margin,
Yeah.
all the way through to the best software companies on the planet, I have no choice but to navigate how to make the most of this technology and make sure that they serve their customers well.
Yes.
So I think it's a great opportunity.
Yeah.
Have you seen many success stories? I mean, it's early days, but
Early days.
I've seen some operators picking these up and the numbers are looking good. But then I think it comes down to scale.
Yeah.
Can you get 3, 4, 5, 10 companies under your operating model? And again, you can just see how this could potentially play out.
Yeah, there's a lot of change that they need to bring to these businesses to utilize the advantages available from the technology. And so there's a real risk that without understanding the context of the business, the people that are required to make that thing succeed, the customers that do care about dealing with those people, and a host of other things, that they could kill the patient by doing the heart transplant. That's a good analogy.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And if you think about where the opportunities exist in a traditional business, it's like the first thing people do is all the systems very quickly. They're all heavyweight. They're all slow. They're all probably very easy to replicate through these AI tools. And then there's also all the customer service. Customer service in traditional business is not well run. I think there's huge opportunities there. And then obviously it comes all the cost saving through headcount, right? Like there's probably a few people where, again, we're not trying to replace everybody's role, but like there are definitely opportunities to augment your current team with AI and get better outcomes. So I just think, but most people don't and probably never will be able to understand the opportunities here, right? So you can see entrepreneurs diving into that opportunity because it's just so ripe and there's so much potential. And most of those companies also, if you think about the New Zealand companies in that space, quite easy to take them offshore now as well. If they obviously are a more traditional software play, even not, I think it is a really good idea. I still think the challenge of maybe working with that business owner, all the things you'd expect probably still exist in that conversation. You probably need to get in there and run it yourself, which a lot of people think they can just leave the operators in there to do it and they don't have to do any work. That's what they all want to do is not do any work. I don't think that exists. I mean, you might get lucky where there's a GM in there that, you've just hit the unicorn.
Yeah.
I don't know what your experience is here, but there's hard work behind all this. There's just no way you just do this on an advisory type role where you own the business and don't do the work. You actually have to go into the business and actually work in them, which I think for me would be tough. Like going into a traditional business, 50, 60 hours a week, and like there'll be a lot of grind there. Like it's not easy.
Totally agree. Yeah. Keith, we've jumped into a really fascinating subject. I want to move gears slightly and talk about Keith.
Cool.
So left Zimbabwe at 18 years old. What was the impetus and what was that experience like?
I'm a 5th generation Zimbabwean. So left when I was 18 in 2002, so I'm 40 now. And back then, Zimbabwe, those of you that don't know much about it, was in a pretty difficult place. So my family and I immigrated here to New Zealand, and I'll kind of rush through this part, but ultimately went to university in Dunedin where, 80% of the success I've had in my life have come from that network. So going to university in Dunedin has been, very good experience. It was a bit difficult for me, coming from, what I like to say to my friends is from the savannah to basically, Dunedin. You can use whatever description you want for Dunedin. But that was a real head twist for me going from, Africa to Dunedin. Yeah. And it was pretty much that transition. But in the end, a very, very good decision. So was there for 3 years. And then the way I like to tell the story from here is went to Australia for 10, London for 2, San Francisco for 18 months, and then back to New Zealand during the COVID lockdown, so 2020. And obviously we'll get into the story from there. So been in New Zealand ever since.
Yes. And your first company that succeeded, the big exit, Cloud Conformity.
That's correct,
so when did you start that and how?
Yeah, great question. So that was started in 2015-16. So we were based in Sydney, Australia at the time. And I'll kind of take it from my perspective and then I'll bring the co-founders into the mix. So I was, at the time, was in one of these moments where I was trying to unlock the entrepreneurial bone again. And a bunch of really good mates were working together at a government department in Sydney. So they were in the technology team and the cloud team. And one of them, Michael, I knew very well as a friend. We drank beers together. We did a lot together. And ultimately, they started a AWS consulting business, right? And I kind of got my fingers in there to help them as somebody that was capable of potentially, driving the sales side of this. And they were trying to launch a consulting business. And I was kind of having my fingers in a few pies trying to start. And really, this is how Cloud Conformity was born, right? So it was born out of a services business. Now, that services business didn't really get off the ground. So you couldn't say it had $1 million in, consulting revenue and converted it into a software play. It was done really early in the piece by my now co-founder of my current business. He's obviously the same CTO from both businesses. And so it was born through essentially his experience of trying to solve problems with managing AWS inside this government department, right? Again, the folks who listen to this probably don't know a lot about the technical side of this, but really in simplicity, when you move your business applications to run your software company or run your business on AWS, great platform, obviously incredible business, but ultimately there are challenges when it comes to managing that, monitoring that, managing security, compliance, government, all these things. So really the category was, we were globally in the first cohort of companies globally to launch in this category. And so that's pretty much how it was born. So it was really born from his challenges as a cloud architect inside this government department. He couldn't find the tooling to help him get the job done, and ultimately just kind of built it himself. And that's kind of how it was born. So it was a total of 4 co-founders. And a very complementary group, by the way. So I think this is worth mentioning because there'll be folks listening to this going, how to form those teams and what makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, one, I'm a huge fan of working with friends. Not everybody would agree with that. I've had only good experiences with this. Obviously, you have your challenges. There's no way you could say you haven't. But pretty much everyone I've worked with the last 10 years are my friends.
So I would assume that's because you've got trust. Is that right?
100%. So that's basically all it comes down to, right? And we'll talk a lot about this about building teams, and the teams that we have today we've all been together for 10 or 12 years, right? So I put a massive premium on this. This is really, really important. I think that really, that can get you through some pretty tough times. If you've got that sort of relationship where you can be honest with each other, where you can tell each other everything that's bad about what's happening, what you're trying to achieve in the day-to-day of trying to make this successful, I think that's really worked for me. And we've done that again with this new business.
Cloud Conformity was born of you solving a problem that was very connected to one of your co-founders, one of your friends.
Correct.
Michael?
Yep.
Yep. And
2 mics, by the way.
Yep. 2 mics.
Yep.
Okay, just for confusing sakes. Yeah. And so you had the services arm, which was okay. How did you spot the opportunity to start building the product? Thanks for listening, and apologies for the interruption. I wanted to share with you that this show is one that we, the team, collectively pour a lot of effort into. There's resources that are involved. We have producers, promoters, and wonderful guests that share their time with us so that you may learn and possibly, hopefully, make some impact on the world as a result of that learning. The only thing I ask of you is go and check out my website. There's a diagnostic tool on there. There's a free downloadable chapter of my upcoming book, remarkably called 2 Commas. And there is some other fascinating resources that I'm not going to tell you about because you need to go to the website to check them out. So thanks for listening, and please continue enjoying the show.
I think really what was happening is that ultimately there was a need inside the services business to try and streamline how we were potentially going to serve these customers. And I think Mike just saw the opportunity that ultimately the best way to service the problem in the market. So if you think about the origin of the idea, which I wasn't part of the services business, but the original thesis there was everybody's migrating to the cloud. Everybody's going to need help to do that. And if you actually take a step back and go, how has that market evolved over the last 10 years? Pretty much every services company that launched and trying to help people migrate from on-premise environments or whatever, co-location to the cloud, all of them have been acquired, right? So if they'd even stuck with that idea, they would have sold.
What was your growth like?
Yeah, great question. So we launched to market in March 2017, right? So it took a little while to get a decent product to market. We had like an MVP that we were working with companies like Xero early on in the piece in 2016.
Alpha kind of users.
Yeah, alpha users. Very much this product was nowhere near really like a preferred production environment, right? So it was very much trying to like build this business whilst we were validating the market opportunity. Then we basically got to the point where we were like, okay, there's something here, right? There's something here where we can take this product to market and we think we can get customers. And so the first product the first sort of deal that we did, he actually, interestingly enough, I'll give him a shout out. His name's Lucas. We just brought him on board as a customer in my new business last week. So I'll talk about that relationship. Yeah, so he was our very first customer at Cloud Conformity. I'll never forget. So at Cloud Conformity, you could sign up with a credit card and you could do it on month to month. So
B2B or B2C?
B2B, very B2B. So classic customer, just for the folks listening, would be someone like an Air New Zealand, a Kiwi Bank, a startup like Tracksuit or Halter, depending on what category you're in, as long as they're leveraging AWS, we could essentially talk to them about our offering. And so that was a $228 credit card purchase. And Michael and Shabby is the other gentleman's name. We were sitting in the WeWork in Sydney, and 9 a.m. in the morning, and we just all got up off our desks and walked straight downstairs to the beer pump, and we had our first beer, right? So you'll see that
all of the
we were so excited to have someone just buy our product. It was just, the feeling was just, I can't even explain it. It was just
doing that first deal.
It was incredible, right? So we knew the guy, and obviously we had some conversation. It wasn't like it was completely like he self-serviced this. He obviously plugged his credit card in one day without really telling us, and paid the $228. So that's how life started. And we grew to about 200 customers globally in under 2.5 years, and about $6 million in ARR. So we went from at 0 in March 2017 to about $6 million in ARR in October 2019 when we got acquired. The best thing about this business wasn't necessarily this group of friends coming together. It wasn't necessarily that we had the best product. It wasn't necessarily had the best team. You couldn't argue that we were the best at everything. That's not true. What we happened to get very lucky in is that our market timing for this particular problem was absolutely perfect, right? So what ended up happening was, and again, at the time, I thought it was really hard to go from 0 to 6 million ARR. Like, it sounds easy, but like at the time, this was like seriously stressful to try and actually go and do this. We didn't even know what was possible, right? Yeah. So like none of us had that experience because everything else we'd done had failed. And so it was a really, if you kind of, as I sit back years later and go, how did this even happen?
What was the formula?
Was the fact that we were selling a product that was solving a problem that no one else was solving. And the problem was big enough that it needed to be solved right now. Right. And that problem, without getting too technical, was basically people didn't have visibility. They couldn't see where those problems existed in their AWS deployments. It's just that simple. They just couldn't see. Like, so that's where it started. It was like, okay, hold on. I've got, a bunch of applications in the cloud. And I need a pane of glass to just contextualize what's going on in here. And then obviously the underlying pain point we were solving was obviously more security compliance and best practice back then. And it was just market timing, right? So we were one of the sort of first, let's call us 5 companies in the world that were really doing this. And every single company in this category was acquired in 2019, 2020. The whole category was not wiped out. That's not the right word. But these are all independent companies of less than, say, 100 staff each, all acquired and bolted onto bigger security platform plays.
Yeah.
So they all got acquired by publicly listed security companies, and they still exist. Those products are still in circulation today.
Yeah, being wound into those companies.
Correct. So it was just, how could you, and often what happens in these sectors is when one company makes a move, everyone else needs to catch up, right? So if you end up being the vendor that doesn't either acquire this capability or build it, you're in that bucket we talked about at the beginning of this show, which is you're in that bucket where you're not innovating, you're done. So it's super interesting.
I talk about it from a founder's perspective, is if you time your exit right, so you time the entry right and your exit right, then one of the ways to tell whether that's happening is look around at the likely acquiring pool, typically international, typically listed companies. And if they're starting to do like acquisitions, if it's popping off in that space, get your shit ready and get yourself an advisor
100%.
and get out there, because that's the moment, right?
Yeah.
If you wait 6, maybe, if you wait 12 months, definitely,
it's gone. Window's gone.
Yeah.
It's not completely gone. You might pick up a couple of the laggard vendors that are playing a bit more of a defensive play. It's not, but
the premium's gone.
Of course, the premium's gone, right? All the multiples are gone.
Could be double.
And you want to honestly get FOMO multiples. That's what you really want, right? So if you look at Palo Alto Networks is a very big, probably the leading global security player in our space. They picked up an AI company the other day. Again, I don't know how much of this is public, but not a lot of revenue, and the revenue multiple was crazy.
Insane, like
right? In hundreds, right? So to your point, if that was, let's say, a year from now, might be 10. Totally different outcome. So I think you're spot on with that in the sense that at this moment in time, everybody was circling, right? So we, Michael, who was the CEO of this business, was fielding regular inbound acquisition interest across all the vendors in our space. So that doesn't happen if it isn't that moment that you just referenced where It's just all these vendors are operating in the same space at the same time, solving the same problem for customers. They hear the same things, and then they all react.
Yes.
And they'll react for 6 to 9 months, and then they move to the next problem.
Yeah, totally.
The thing is, you got to catch that window.
100%.
And so if you're not on the pulse, you miss the whole window, and then you end up in this position we were talking about earlier, where you're stuck in limbo. You're a zombie company, because now you need to kind of like change tacks and go, okay, now I'm going to build a profitable business.
Yes.
Now I'm building, like, your whole vision for this company just shifts because you've missed the window. And by the way, picking the window is not easy.
No
one's saying that that's just written. Someone's telling you that it's happening.
No, you need to pigeon land with a memo. That's
you also need to be in the field.
Yes, you do.
Like, you need to be in the field, listening,
yes.
and you have to be very active.
Yes.
If you say you're just parked up in NZ with the odd trip to the US without real feelers, you can miss the whole thing.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Now, notwithstanding the timing being right for the business, what we both know is that the early stages of growth are hard. Peter Thiel wrote a book called 0 to 1, I should say. And the notion is that the first million is the hardest. So what was your first million like?
I mean, so again, been through this a couple of times, currently going through it as well. So it's very raw. So if the experience that we had going from 0 to 1, obviously, I think I can tell two stories here, right? Because the first story is our timing was fantastic, but our deal sizes were so small.
Yeah, 228.
Right.
So increased.
So yeah, it did, of course. But you don't have any of that knowledge at the time, right? So like, you win your first customer, $228 on a non-recurring relationship, you're going to take years to get anywhere near this, right? And we obviously had all the struggles of like, honestly, there'll be tons of founders out there going, oh, product's so good, let's do PLG. Okay, like, PLG is really hard, like really hard.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's product-led growth.
Of course. Yeah. Product-led growth. Super duper hard. And most people don't even know what it means. Yeah. Right. So like, there's so many ways to take a product to market. Inside our product, when we told you there was something wrong with your cloud environment, we also provided the sort of static remediation steps and all of the static code. So think about it for a second. If you're a person receiving a little security alert, we would then provide you with an extensive guide, like step by step, on what you need to do. And then we'd actually give you the code that you just copy and paste to go and fix something. Now, brilliant, right? That was, 9 years ago. What we did is we made that public, right? Now, we did that obviously thinking this was going to help us with SEO, and this was something, but you have no idea what's really going to happen here. This is all a bit of a gamble. But this was a real secret source for us. So I'd say 50% of all sales leads of those 200 came from these knowledge-based pages. And we were ranking number 1 organically on Google. We spent nothing on AdWords. And we were even above AWS's pages for this. So like, you would see when you go to Google and type in something technical about anything to do with like the problems that we solved, we were ranking like number 1 on like 10 or 15 keyword searches organically because of the quality of these pages. Again, I am not an SEO expert and couldn't talk about it in depth today. It's very complicated now, especially with LLMs coming into the mix. It's everybody trying to work out what to do. I don't think anyone does. I saw some good stuff on LinkedIn the other day that was helpful, but it's clearly no one really knows what to do. So that was an incredible play. So that is not PLG, by the way. That's not product-led growth. That's content-led growth, which people sometimes get confused. So content-led growth is where someone would basically read this page. They'd have to unlock it. So it was like basically blocked after like 5 seconds. It would block you. And then you'd have to give us your details to read the rest of the page. Then we have your details. Then the sales team would reach out. Yep. You know how it works. So that was 50% of our lead sources. The other 50% was a mixture of what I call ecosystem-based sales, where we spent a lot of our time investing in AWS relationships and partners, right? So in our world, again, you can translate this into your own world, is like cloud consulting partners or professional services companies and AWS like sales reps and technical folks, right? So we spent all of our energy in trying to make sure that we had tight relationships with those folks. And pretty much 80% of all the deals came from content-led growth and partnership-led growth. So a lot of people that are building companies will know those terms because they're thinking about what model works best for them. And then the rest came from direct. So I'd say like 20-25% came from direct, like sales outbound efforts, but we definitely needed salespeople to actually close the deals. So we did have about a third of that customer base that was credit card transactions, self-service. Obviously the deal sizes were smaller, but our biggest deal, over time got into like, 200-300K a year, right? So like they obviously, you've heard the old adage that if someone's, someone is always willing to pay you 10x what they currently pay today. I really subscribe to that. It's very true.
2.5 years, 0 to 6 million.
Great.
How far into that journey did you hit one?
About a year.
About a year.
About a year. So it would have been like, I didn't quite look at the numbers
6x.
before this, but about a year.
Yeah, so in 18 months, you 6x'd it.
Correct.
So that's phenomenal.
And so we just took, I'll never forget it.
Yeah.
I think this is what we're talking about. So one of the big buying moments in the Australian market is June, because obviously in the financial year is end of June.
Yes.
And we just, I remember like it was yesterday. So it was June 2018, and we signed the biggest names in the industry in that year, like Qantas, Telstra. We were signing the biggest customers, and these were much bigger deals. So the reason that it accelerated was the deals were just much bigger, but we also maintained the velocity of those sort of mid-sized customers. And we were signing some really big US customers at this point. So we again, this is one of my fondest memories of, again, if we go to some of the favorite moments, I'll never forget this. We had an inbound lead from one of these content-led plays. Got on the phone with this guy. He was in the US. And the best part about the US is sometimes the decision makers, you don't need to speak to anybody else, right? One, guy or gal make the decision pretty much instantaneously. Now, that doesn't happen in Australia. New Zealand, you need this decision by committee. It takes much longer, right? You don't have people standing up like that, making these big decisions all alone. There's like a long process that has to happen with most of these companies. But it was like a $200K deal in 4 days. Like amazing. It was just, I remember it so, I know the name of the company, I know the name of the guy. I know everything about this, about this company. And it was just like it was a car classifieds website, like obviously quite a big business, but he just knew what he wanted. He had the budget. He liked the product. He tried it for 2 days. And he bought it.
Why mess around?
And so I think that's the power of the American market, honestly, for people listening is
Yes.
not saying that just going to happen to you, but like the way they buy things in America is totally different to here. It is, it's just, it's not even the same ball game. You can find the right person and do deals really quickly. And also they're quite direct. They'll just be like, nah, they'll just move on. And it's actually nice. Like when you want to get that quick no or yes, where a lot of stuff out here drags for a very long time.
Yeah, that's quite insightful. I think that from here and Australia included, as people look at the US, because it's a scale thing.
Yep.
But it's actually also that you've got markedly different nature of how you do business.
They love to buy products and services. There's just no other way to word it. I mean, that's the whole market is wired that way.
So the ultimate acquirer was Trend Micro.
Correct.
2.5 years into the business. When did you start the conversations with them? So how far into the journey?
Yeah, so this was interesting. So the whole cycle probably took 6 months, not just with Trend, but with other potential interested parties. So we had some
go out to market, or did people come?
No. This was all inbound. Like we weren't sitting there, with a for sale sign on the business because we were, honestly, we were growing. Actually, the story goes, we had a $18 million Series B already wrapped up with a strategic vendor in that Series B with a buyout clause. So we already knew that we were in a pretty good spot, right? So we were like, okay, hold on, an $18 million Series B, obviously USD. Existing investors.
Had you taken the money in?
Sorry? No, we never took it. No. We signed the term sheet, but we had a shop clause in there. So I think
shop clause?
This is really important.
Yeah.
So as a group, and this is where founders can obviously either fall out or just be completely misaligned, you obviously need to work out, are we selling? And so we had offers. Actually, this is important. I just remembered. We had already had offers earlier on in the journey, right? So we sold for 120 mil NZD, but we had offers early on, like really early on, late 2017, from a Boston-based company. Again, and maybe it wasn't necessarily like a term sheet offer, but like the conversation went all the way to the finish line, and we said no, and that was for obviously a much lower number, but. You get pressure tested as founders in this. This is a very positive conversation to have with your partners. Obviously, not everybody gets to have these. But when you do have them, it's really interesting to see how people think about this question and what their ambition really is. It's really, honestly, it's super telling. And you'll be surprised what happens when there's an actual offer on the table.
Yeah.
Very different from you sitting there going, I'm not selling, at least it's 200 million.
Yeah.
But when someone drops a $60 million offer in front of you, like, okay, hold on.
That's real.
Of course.
Yeah. So how do you have those conversations?
So it was really interesting because I think we made a point of having these conversations, over a couple of beers every quarter, just talking about it, right? Like what's everybody's goals? Everyone wasn't often saying exactly the same thing. Some would be like, I want to build $1 billion company. I want to build, the classic words that you'd expect to hear out of people's mouths. And, But when push came to shove, if I talk about my own feeling towards this, was we had this Series B in the bag, right? So that means we would have gone from, say, 60 or 70 people to maybe 150, 200.
Yeah.
And we'd also have a big target on our back in terms of expectations. In other words, right, you've just raised 18 million. That would have been, circa $120 million valuation. You need to grow.
I need to sell.
Yeah. And also, so I think this is where you need to be on. I think where I reflect fondly on the decision is I think we were all quite honest, certainly with ourselves individually and then as a group. So my sort of view was, one, it's a bird in the hand. I was about to get married and have some kids. So I was not necessarily ready to leave the journey, but I was certainly ready for some financial security because we had not had that at all, which again, we will talk about. And then
you hadn't paid yourselves really much at all.
Yeah, we'll pull that off as a side topic. I think it's really interesting because the world has changed a lot. So one, I was kind of ready to see some dollars flow in.
Yeah.
Two, I was concerned about where we were with our own innovation story. So again, all of my colleagues and founders, everyone with their guts out, right? So it's not throwing anyone under the bus, but the way I felt was we weren't moving that product as fast as we should have. So my fear was you raise all this money, you slow down even further, and you fall into this zombie category, right? Which, again, I didn't have a crystal ball, but I was really worried about speed of execution on product. For the past year, we hadn't really been on the front foot like we were in the early days. And then the other piece was just the ability of our group to actually go and run a company of 150, 200 people across 3 time zones. Do we even have the leadership depth? In my opinion, those 3 things were the reasons that I voted to sell. Was I didn't have enough conviction that as a group we could actually pull off the next phase. And it's, in my opinion, I have no regrets over that. Could we have gone and built, if you think about it, the market category leader now is just sold for 32 billion US, so like 50 billion NZ. That could have been us. You could say that. There's no reason we couldn't have been that, but I can almost guarantee you wouldn't have been because of these fears that I think were very real in terms of the business not being able to get to that level. Really hard to go and scale a company from 60 to 150 people and it's not easy. How many companies grind out at those points? Tons.
It's the whole more companies die from gluttony than do from starvation.
Honestly, it has been
smaller, leaner, meaner is often better.
I much prefer that, right? So my whole philosophy today is much more in line with that than growth at all costs, bloat this thing out, get as many people as we can to go solve the opportunity, because unless you have incredible product market fit, like incredible, you can do it. But a lot of these companies in those stages are chaotic. Yeah, right? And they're not run that well.
So you turned down the first potential suitor. You then went back where you continued growing the business. And so you said it took about 6 months to do the deal. So that means you're 2 years in. So Trend Micro bought the business.
Correct.
So how many others were sniffing around?
At least 10.
Okay.
Well, at least 10. Yeah, this was like, some in different levels of intensity. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't like, 10 in DD, for example. Yeah. But there were definitely a lot of interested parties and very famous companies as well, right? So like, again, don't know how much I can share, but these are, really large companies in the space that were very keen on an acquisition for us. So they made a first offer, which we actually pushed back and then got the number up. And then, it's the classic, you got the deadline of, Friday, 5 p.m. or we're walking, the normal deal making process. And so those were big soul searching moments for us because that's when the rubber was really in the road. A lot of the folks in our founding group thought we should have held up for more. There was obviously a lot of demand. And, some of the offers that were coming on the table were from one of the richest guys in the world that everybody would know. So we didn't, from where I was sitting, like, what was it like? You sell it for 120 or 160, you've still done well, right? You've still set yourself up for whatever's next in your life.
Because the quantum could be.
I just think that's probably been a good trait, is not being too greedy.
Yeah,
I think we all weren't too greedy because we all needed to come together and make that decision. Because if you get greedy, you can miss the window.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, so 100%. Back to the timing thing.
Yeah.
So there's an expression which I'll share, which is the rich exit too soon. So in other words, they realize that an opportunity which is real for them to take some money off the table, either partially or in totality, is often better than waiting for that next one that might come along, which is 50% more, potentially, because you might miss that window of opportunity, potentially.
Totally.
But then there's also stories where people have gone, I turned down 100 this year and then I got 500 the next year.
There's both sides of the coin.
So,
I don't think any.
And I think that's about luck as much as anything.
But if you think about it, so under what circumstances would we have said no? I think we would have said no if there was conviction that no matter what happened, we could, we're going to turn this into a $500 million company. Yeah. That conviction, I'm not saying wasn't there, but in my opinion, wasn't there with the level of intensity you would expect. Like, you need to really, every single bit of the opportunity and the people involved need to be 100% swimming in the same direction. And often that is not the case. Not in my experience anyway. So again, I reflect fondly on it because we could have easily made a very different call and probably wouldn't be here. I genuinely believe that was one of the most sound decisions we've ever made. And I think the 4 founders, so Michael being the CEO, was always keen on this. Mike, the technical founder, always thought we could have obviously stuck it out. Makes sense. Obviously, that was kind of his baby from a product perspective. And Shabby, the other founder, again, thought we could have done better. But when push comes to shove and you kind of translate the number into your bank account, people make different decisions. So it's very easy to sit there and say, I want X.
Yes.
But when you then put it back to the hardships of what you've been through to get there, I guess that's the opportunity, right?
Yeah. What were the terms like on that offer?
Actually, really good.
Right.
So this is something I constantly scratch my head about. So most founders, and again, I've listened to a few of your shows, have a bunch of different, golden handcuffs. They're locked into restraints of trade, all these sort of things. Trend was an excellent acquirer. And again, I have no reason to say that unless it was true, in the sense that it was a full cash deal up front. So full cash deal up front, arguably I could have left the next day. What I liked about the model was I was there on my own terms. I mean, in other words, if I was there for 1 day, 100 days, 500 days, that's on my own. That's off my own back, right? So we had a decent sort of retention bonus to keep us there for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And these were nice numbers, don't get me wrong. But ultimately life is too short, right? Once you've kind of been through this, what I did, which I think, again, I feel proud about what I did, was made sure everybody in the team was looked after, got the integration done, spent a lot of time making sure the whole thing was working. And essentially at some point I just became redundant, right? I wasn't, they could create roles for me. But I was obviously, I was now in New Zealand, which I wasn't in the US, and all the opportunities in the US, right? So, and again, I just think my heart wasn't in their long term. And I think they actually cut a really good deal. I think it was really clever, right? Because as the 4 of us, one left really quickly. The other, actually, I was the first, beg your pardon. I was the first, 9 months. The other 2 were about 2 years. Okay. And then Michael was 4. So again, everyone got their different level of what they needed out of that.
It sounds like a really good deal.
Yeah, it was really nice for plenty.
12x of revenue, cash up front, no handcuffs, ability to walk away immediately, yet a good enough acquisition team and business for you to stick around for at least 9 months, up to 2 years. So pretty good deal all round.
And I think the main other thing that's useful to note here is, as part of thinking about the acquirers, because there were options, they are about 8,000 staff globally. So, as far as we're concerned here, that's a big company. But some of the others were 100,000, 200,000, 300,000.
You get lost.
So we were sitting there going, hold on, Trend is a really good suitor because they don't do a lot of acquisitions. They do maybe 1 a year. You could even argue they don't do that. So we were somewhat special. That felt good. We knew they needed this. So from a technology stack perspective, there was actually quite a lot of synergy. And we knew that we would be important to whatever's next. In other words, we wouldn't just get lost in the noise of 100,000. In a 100,000 person company, we're just that's a tech acquisition. There's nothing else to it, right? Whereas I think from a talent perspective, they actually needed our talent pool to lift their own game in the field on this particular topic. So no, really went super well certainly from our perspective.
Yeah. So you're quite young when this happened, in your 30s.
Yep.
And so living back in NZ, just about to have your first child,
yes,
get a big payday. What do you do after that?
Excellent question. So, I mean, again, as I reflect on maybe this community of exited founders I'm part of, this is the number one topic, right? So once you sell your baby, sell your identity, people really get quite lost.
Totally lost.
I'm sure you felt that as well with some of your exits as well.
First one, yeah.
And so And I'm not the type to sit there and not do very much. Obviously, I love playing golf. I love having a good time. I love being on holiday. But like, I'm a purpose-driven guy. I actually love working. It sounds a bit strange to even say out loud. I actually love working.
Yeah,
I enjoy it. I want to do it. I have a great time doing it. And that's kind of why I'm still back in the trenches again now. Again, this is where Dunedin comes in. So I ended up buying into a company here locally. It was a startup venture studio called Dovetail, and then got rebranded to Paloma. So anyone in the industry that knows of they got a VC fund, they build companies for a living. And I knew the two founders from university, right? So we were all connected through that Dunedin ecosystem, and we had a bunch of mutual friends. And it was a perfect place for me to kind of be straight after the acquisition. So I wanted to stay sharp on building companies, and I wanted to stay sharp on everything venture. I wanted to be in that ecosystem, but I wanted to break from the day-to-day grind of it's super stressful. I mean, any founder listening to this, it's super stressful. And again, I might have a lot of energy, but my energy reserves were gone, right? So I needed a place to rebuild that energy reserves, but stay sharp and stay focused. And that was awesome, right? So that business, we ended up growing from 50 to 150 people in that period. Obviously, all sorts of stuff happened in the market as we're all across, and we had to reduce that business down again. But yeah, really great experience in terms of, working with friends again, running a business. And we ended up, Paloma now has, 15, 20 companies that have been built from scratch, literally founder in a pitch deck. And we help co-build those companies and co-fund those companies. And that portfolio is, probably worth $400 or $500 million now. I think what I discovered through that journey is who I believe I really am, which is I love the 0 to 1 stuff, right? That is, I think, I didn't,
I'm the same.
Again, I never knew that because I tried it multiple times and failed. It doesn't mean I knew that's who I was. But I've really got a sense now, after all these experiences of where I'm most happy and most satisfied. And I remember, you might enjoy this, but I wrote myself a document kind of soon afterwards about what are the things that actually make me tick? What do I enjoy about work? It was quite a fun exercise. I just kind of wrote it.
Right?
Yeah, I just wrote it, and I still got it there in Notion. It was a really cool doc, and it's not very long. It's just a bunch of bullet points about what makes me tick. And that's helped me make all the decisions I've made since then, because when you're in those sort of reflective moments, you actually kind of peel the whole thing back to first principles and go, what makes me tick, right? And for me right now, it's basically obviously family and the startup I'm currently running. Those are the two things I'm investing 100% of my energy in.
I would encourage you to be reflective in the future when you review that list based upon an awareness of how your values may shift.
I assume it changes, right?
Yeah.
Have you done the same exercise?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. So business number 4 for me was deep in the startup space. And by then I'd achieved financial freedom 3 times over. And so it was, I made it into a purpose venture in my head, solving customer service at scale, helping liberate people from the shitty customer service job through deployment of early AI.
Still trying to solve that one.
Still trying to solve that problem. Yep. And so that was what I made it mean. In reality, when I was honest with myself, it was adding more zeros, right? That was what I was endeavoring to do. And so I got stuck in this, and I've told the story before. So the abbreviated version is my job then was running a company of 45 people across 2 companies, and I was stuck in the meat and the shit sandwich, right? And I was hating it. I wasn't having a good time at all. And then I was rubbing up against burnout and just not
totally.
Yeah. And the frame of reference that I'd used was on a values set that was about 7 years old.
Oh, nice.
And I hadn't reflected cleanly on what was actually most important to me at that point in time.
Yeah.
And once I got clear on it, I'm like, what the hell am I doing this for? I'm killing myself.
Honestly, when you have the framework in the background, making the decision is actually quite simple.
Yeah.
It's actually, what I did is I literally put it into a table and mark whatever I was planning to do next against those things.
Yes.
Out of 10, it's very basic.
Yeah.
You might have done it differently, but it gave me my answer in a split second.
Yes.
And you work out where you're, I think it's all about what are you investing your time into? I mean, that is all that really matters. So I agree with you. Mine was probably less about values, because obviously I understand what that means. Mine was probably more about, for example, one of them would be I just love being part of the global tech community, not just the New Zealand or the Australian tech community. Where I get a lot of my kicks is okay, well, I know people in all these different countries, and I leverage those relationships to help me get where I need to in the business scene. So I loved global, right? And that's not easy just to, okay, you go start a company tomorrow. That takes 4 years to get to that moment, right? So it takes forever to actually get to that moment, which was something that motivated me. I might have struggled a little bit as an isolated solo founder, just trying to work it out. Like that's hard, right? So like, anyway, we'll talk about it, but I think it's super interesting because you return to that value set or that set of things that makes you tick. Really helps you make decisions.
It's funny with values, and I'll make this the bookend of the conversation, is that people hold them so near and dear. You know, they're very precious to us, right? It's how we view the world, how we make all of our decisions, how we interact with other people.
100%.
Especially under duress. And so they're sacrosanct to us. And so we think in the moment that they're not going to change much over time because they're so important to us. And the really simple litmus test is to look backwards 10 years and go, are they the same now as they were 10 years ago? You brought kids up a second ago. And so as soon as kids come into the equation,
change the list.
Changes so much, right? You might keep one or two of them, but you're going to flip them out.
What do you see? Do you see a change, like, again, just at a high level? I assume the answer here is 3 or 4 or decades old in terms of values, but you're adding new things that pop into that paradigm there's no specific time, but because you've done it maybe a few times. I assume it's just somewhat evolving, 2 or 3 stay roughly the same, or they somewhat tweak, and you end up with like half that are the same as they've always been, and another half that are somewhat new.
Yeah.
Is that probably a fair?
So, no, for me, it's been 2 that have been consistent over time, and the one that sits at the top of the list is growth. So growth is my number one value. And so I don't think that will ever change. But financial success was number 2 for the longest of time.
I assume it's down the bottom now, right? Or not down the bottom, but it's further down.
So it's success in other forms. It's success through impact is actually much more important to me than financial successes now.
Very nice.
And so the luxurious position of being able to achieve that thing, so you can move on from that. But if you don't acknowledge that, then you end up being the unhappy billionaire.
Of course.
I'm not a billionaire. But I know a couple, but largely they're pretty miserable people.
Oh, yeah.
They've prioritized financial success as being the number one thing, and that takes ruthlessness to get there and an unbelievable intensity of focus, a willingness to leave everything else aside.
I think you're absolutely
just pursuing this thing, right?
Yeah.
And so having the presence of mind, the mechanism to be able to go back and reflect on it properly is just such a powerful.
I think this is a really important thing to discuss, right? Because if you think about, okay, where does your drive come from? Where does my drive come from? It was never about money. You could say whatever, you're lying. It's always in the top 3. Sure, it's always in the top 3, but it is not the first one, right? Like often when I'm doing things in business, I'm competing with myself. That is my number one competitor, is that I just think I like, for example, like anything, even that last business that we sold, the biggest driver inside of me was to prove I could do it. That was just, I can't argue with that. That is, whether I like it or not, that was the thing that got me out of bed each day. And I worked 12-hour days. I worked all weekend. Why? I wasn't like chasing 100. Yes, it was in your top 3. Of course, I'd be lying if it wasn't. But it was about a personal crusade. And I actually think this is something that will never leave me. And I think you put it in the growth. You could put it into the growth bucket.
Yeah, I feel like
but it's like I compete with myself more than anybody else. And I've kind of always been that way.
To improve yourself.
Always. And it's always to just test myself. For example, like even if you think about the opportunity now, it is just a personal crusade to prove that when I say I mean obviously come in and with the team try and turn something into a good outcome.
Yes.
It's like I'm competing with myself. I want to constantly evolve what I'm achieving and what I can do, but it's not driven by money. Again, I think it's dropped down the totem pole. Still very much in the top 3 or top 4, but yeah, there's that inner drive for me to just constantly reinvent myself and keep evolving and keep trying to take myself to new heights. I'm sure, again, you're very similar because growth has to be that is what growth is.
I think that's what we're here for, actually, as a species. That's what we've been put on the earth, is to realize what we're capable of. And the least happy people, I believe, are those that have gone into a different space. Either they've decided to retire early if they've made a bunch of money, or they've decided to you can prioritize your family, absolutely, because there's growth that comes from that, right? Because you're developing other people along the way. Yeah. But I think there's a lot of people that have lost sight of what I believe to be the core purpose for us.
Yeah, no, agreed.
I'll pull us back to Paloma for a second, because you went from being a founder to exiting to being in a venture studio to going back to being a co-founder.
Yes.
And so I just want to round out the studio situation, as we talked about previously, Unavailable, TRA, and the great story they've done with those guys.
Big shout out to those guys. Yeah.
Big shout out. Yeah. And so you're super capable and great products and companies they've released. But what's the pluses and the minuses in your mind of being a part of a venture studio?
Yeah, great question. So I might just take it back for folks that don't really know what a venture studio is. So a venture, again, I'm not going to give you the Oxford Dictionary definition here, but ultimately a venture studio is a place where a founder can come to get a suite of different capabilities or services to enable them to go and launch their business idea, right? That's probably the simplest way I can describe it, right? So, at Paloma, what we were doing was essentially talking to a lot of, day one founders, and a definition of a day one founder is literally someone with an idea. They might not even have a pitch deck. They might not have any slides. They just have an idea, right? And so the specialty of a venture studio, and again, I'm generalizing for the rest of the market because I do think founders should at least consider that, is this really tight ecosystem of ex-operators that have capital, that have expertise, that have time, that have the entire infrastructure, talent, to basically help you take your idea from 0 to 1, right? And 0 to 1 could be anything, right? Like 0 to 1, if you think about Paloma as example, their strike rate of companies going from 0 to $1 million ARR is 90%. That's high, right? No one,
That's the opposite of the market.
Exactly. So what I would argue is, now obviously that's not going to happen in every circumstance because there's Paloma only builds 1 to 2 a year. And it's hard to pick the 1 or 2, by the way. We're obviously trying to de-risk that as much as possible, right? Trying to get the right founders with the right idea. And you've done a ton of pre-seed and seed investing. You know how hard this is, trying to work out which founder is going to be able to go from 0 to 1, which is super hard to do, right? And it can come from any shape and form of founder as well. So it's not just like a particular type. And it's a really awesome, that was a place that I was able to hone my skills from the other side of the table. So I often use that now when I'm talking to VCs, is saying, well, I was a VC for 3 years. Maybe not in the true, like we only had a relatively small fund, right? It was a $10 million fund, but you still had to deploy capital and make decisions. That's basically what a VC is. Yeah. And you had to source opportunities. And it was great to sit on the other side and go, what constitutes a great story and opportunity to warrant a $500,000 seed check? Not easy, right? And again, you know this. We spoke about this at lunch. So I think I actually learned a lot about how VCs tick, and just, what it's like to be on the other side of the table. And so I use a lot of that to my advantage when I'm now out there trying to capital raise for our current businesses. I tend to just cut through the noise much faster, right? There's so much fluff happening in those VC conversations that ultimately I pretty much put all the cards on the table in the first 15 minutes. And those are the facts, right?
How did that go down?
Oh, VCs love it. They absolutely love it because they're not sitting there waiting in call number 3 to like work out where all the skeletons are in your opportunity. It's like, here's the pros, here's the cons, here's the opportunities. Here's maybe some of the bad things that have happened. I'm honest about that. Here it is. Maybe it's churn, or maybe we got, churn in the customer base. Maybe it's churn in staff. Who knows? You just put it out there. And if you don't want to have a second meeting with me, I'll take that as that doesn't match your investment thesis. And that's cool.
Yeah.
I think founders are always trying to tell a good story to VCs, but often I find just telling the truth is much better.
And so you decided to get out of Paloma.
Yep.
And get back into the startup world once more.
Yes.
And so it's essentially kind of version 2.0 of your previous company.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you a little bit about this. This one is a fairly non-straightforward story. So what happened was I left Paloma in May 2023. So obviously, about 18 months since then. And my dream, as I kind of referenced to you, was to go and I've tried 3 or 4 times to build a sales something company. Right. Obviously, in my core, I think sales is still super. If anything, it's getting harder.
More important.
Yeah. Well, not only is it more important, but it is still very hard to actually do. Yeah. Right. So I don't think people appreciate, like, if you're in a company that's got product market fit, selling's easy. Like, if you're in a company today where you've got great product market fit and there's just inbound traffic crawling in your debt, it's easy. Right. I think let's not kid ourselves. The rest of the market don't see that. Right. It is hard. So I've always dreamed about building a business. I often talk about building the next HubSpot. Like, I don't know if you guys know HubSpot and Salesforce. I'm not saying CRM, but like the sales tech VC world is huge. There are so many products, especially now with AI, that are trying to transform how you win customers, how you service customers, how you talk to customers, I think to your earlier point, every single one of those incumbents are under threat because a 2-person, team from in their dorm room are building something next gen with zero clutter in their brain about how to go tackle that problem in an AI native way. So it's a red hot space. And actually, I was sort of pretty deep into this. So I was about 6 months into building and investigating and doing discovery on what problem to solve. So I interviewed 50, 60 CROs and CMOs from my global network, picked up a lot of insights from doing that. I had 2 or 3 ideas. See, the problem I had here was, this might be useful just to talk about, is I didn't have the idea. I didn't have the idea. I don't know if you've been in this position before. I didn't have the idea. I had a bunch of ideas that I thought were good.
Yes.
And I was trying to validate which of those ideas are worth investing my time into, right? And
was it just you?
Oh, just me, yep. So no, I had obviously had access to a bunch of technical co-founders that when I was really, that wasn't a problem.
Yeah.
But then I'll tell you what I did. This is the benefit of potentially a bit of financial security. So I took the whole summer off. So it was November 23, and I was like, I'm going to get into this in February, right? So I obviously, if you look back on that and go, okay, would I have done that if I had the exact right idea in my brain with the intensity that it needed? This is my point of, you need the intensity and the conviction that you will waver from that focus. So I obviously didn't have it. Let's just be blunt about that. Did not have it. And so I, took the summer off and did nothing between November, December, January, did nothing, right? And during this time, the new business called Plarion. So a bit of a non-linear story. I actually joined as a late joining co-founder and co-CEO. I just will explain this a little bit to folks. So what ended up happening was my old co-founder from Cloud Conformity, who was the technical founder of Cloud Conformity, Mike. Yes. He essentially started Plarion straight out the gates after doing Cloud Conformity. He has his own reasons. I probably couldn't even guess what those are. But he obviously had some unfinished business, right? So we sold Cloud Conformity. In his mind, he never finished that product, right? So it makes sense to me as a technical founder. That was his baby. He wanted to get back on the horse, and honestly, that it was actually a good time to do it. 2022. We had numerous conversations about this opportunity. It wasn't the right thing for me at that time, mainly because of the young kids I had. I was quite happy at Paloma, and to be brutally honest, and particularly want to get back into the security market straight away, right? It's a different beast. And what ended up happening was I was the first check into this company. So kind of like what you've done in your career. So we call it a pre-seed check. So pretty much, the 4 or 5 of us put, a total of about 3 or 4 million USD into this company. And so kind of sat on the board and was always part of this company from the very, sort of first breath. And then ultimately I joined the company. I think the timing was right for me. The opportunity, as we just discussed, as I looked at my list that I wrote, it actually ticked 9 out of the 10 boxes. So that list helped me make this decision because I didn't have to come and do this. And so came in to obviously support Mike in trying to, make Plarion a huge success. So again, just to give people context, it's directly again in the cloud security space. But as with any market opportunity, what we built 8 years ago would be a laughing stock right now. We've built the next generation, and typically the next generation means much bigger, much broader, much smarter, much more scalable, and solving many, many, many more problems. So the trend in our industry was to provide these end-to-end platforms. So instead of providing a niche product that did one thing, now does 8 things, right? And so the build was significant. We ended up raising a $10 million seed round from reputable global VCs. And obviously that capital has gone into predominantly building the product. Like the product is significant in terms of size and scale and complexity. So you could argue there's obviously a decent moat there in terms of what we're doing. So I've been with the business now for just over a year.
We've wandered around the startup journey. We've talked a bit about risk. We've talked about founding, talked about teams. Is there any stone that I haven't turned over at this stage?
There's one or two that I'd be keen to just dive into, if you don't mind. They're more sort of war stories from the early days of getting from 0 to 1. And I think the reason I want to bring this up is I just think it's really important to showcase to people building today what it was like 10 years ago. I'm sure there's founders that have been on this call, on your show here that have 20 years, 30 years. Don't get me wrong. I have a lot of respect for people building business 20 years ago and 30 years ago. So I can't comment on that, but I can only comment on the last decade. And so one of the things that I think is really important to note is when we built Cloud Conformity, none of us earned a salary for 2.5 years. Let's just let that sink in for a second. Imagine taking a risk on something that has absolutely almost no chance to succeed. And we were on $0 for 2.5 years. Now, let's just put that in comparison to founders today, where the expectation, I wouldn't call it entitlement because that's almost a bit mean, but like the expectation is you pay yourself on day one, right? And the salary range is somewhere between 75 to 125Ks from what I'm feeling in the field.
Yeah, probably 50 to 70% of what your market worth
100%.
is.
Yeah. And so I just think founders need to be very cognizant that de-risks their life choices in a significant way. So I think they should be very pleased about that.
Yes.
So we actually didn't take a salary until, 2.5 years. And when we did take a salary, it was like 50K.
Right.
Like
wow.
50K doesn't get you to the supermarket or even pay rent.
Yeah.
So like one of the things that I think is important to note, and founders will be feeling this in different ways, is like just how do you pay for your current life when you're building something that, your partner particularly is wondering why you're doing what you're doing. So one of the stories I wanted to tell here is I actually wrote my now wife a PowerPoint in 2016. I've still got the PowerPoint. It's
how did it go down?
It's incredible. It was 6 pages long, and I'll just jump to the last slide because I was more trying to explain almost like what are you doing? Because you leave a very cushy, high-paying sales job with a good global tech company. It's like these are good jobs, right? And what are you doing? Right? And why do I need to pay for your rent? Like there's a lot of stress that can be put on a relationship here, right? So you really got to take your partner on a serious journey, right? Yeah. So I definitely gave her the sizzle here, which was I wrote this slide which talked about 2019 predictions. So I kind of went like 3 to 4 years out. Well, what do I think is going to happen? I actually got 5 out of 6 right. Now, that has nothing to do with any skill on my side, by the way. It's just pure coincidence that I managed to actually deliver on what I wrote in those slides. But the point was, I took her, she was on this journey as much as I was, right? Just think about it, right? Like every piece of stress, all the hard work, she's been on it the whole way through and she's doing it again, right? I think, again, I don't know how your partner views you, but she knows that if I'm not doing this, then I'm probably going to be a mess anyway. Yeah. So ultimately, I think she, deserves almost more credit because she paid for everything in those first 2 years when we were in Sydney. And Sydney, not a cheap place to live.
Expensive.
So we, I had, one of the things that we did in the early days is that all of the founders had side hustles. And that was a real topic, right? So one of the only ways I could pay rent is one of the best things they ever did was buy Afterpay shares at $1 on the IPOs, my last $6,000, which by the way was a bit of a bold bet. Great investment.
Did you exit them?
Oh, multiple times. Right. Absolutely fantastic. Everyone knows Afterpay sold for whatever, 40 billion. I didn't quite take it to the end because I was desperate for that cash. And that was one. And then I had a sales consulting business on the side. So I was actually doing professional services to keep keep everything going. And so the rest of the team it did as well. It was a real challenge to get everybody to quit those, right? Because imagine saying, well, you got to turn off that tap now. Yeah. And focus 100% on something where you're getting paid nothing and you have no customers and you have very little evidence that what you're doing is going to yield results. So it's just important. I think people can take some sort of lessons from it, even if they are picking up a salary. It's probably still not enough for their life bills. I understand that. But there's a massive sacrifice that goes with even attempting to do this full time. Right. But I'm a huge supporter of anybody doing this. I think, as I was saying to you earlier, I think, the end of the day, if you don't take any risk, that is the risk, right? Life is too short. Yes, you've still got to you can work it out. You can, if you have enough conviction that this is the direction you need to be going, I think the risk is totally worth it, right? Yeah, And especially now, if you can actually get paid to do it from the first day, I don't see why you wouldn't do it. It makes total sense to me, right?
Yeah,
It makes sense that. And I actually think it's healthy because it's kind of unhealthy to have $0 coming. It can actually ruin a whole business because you could just give up early.
Yeah.
You just be like, I need money. It's quite simple. You need money to live. And if you can't get it, what do you mean to do, right? So I think that's super interesting. The other thing I was just going to say is, we obviously had all the classic issues, right? We had spouses that worked for the company in the first year or two. That was a real challenge. We had equity issues. Who hasn't? Everyone's had equity issues. Again, you could argue doing that with friends makes that harder or better, depends how you look at it. And then obviously, you think about all the other sacrifices, right? You're not flying business class in the US every couple of weeks. I was flying, obviously back of the plane. I was couch surfing. I went to the US 30 times in 3 years. Wow. And I was almost never really stayed in a hotel. So stayed at my cousin's house in San Francisco.
Backpackers.
Yeah. And so these are things people kind of think they just see the end result and think, okay, well, that was too easy, right? But there was a lot of grinding that has occurred. Even, I don't know about how much time you spend in San Francisco, but the first time you go to San Fran and you book the Tenderloin for 8 nights. Okay, well, that's a pretty big experience, right? So there's things that throughout the journey, we ran out of money 3 times. So I'll never forget we were sponsoring a trade show in New York. Again, cost us like 50 or 60 grand to like sponsor, maybe more, right? And so we were quite aggressive in how we approached the market opportunity. And, couldn't pay I had 10 team members on the rooftop in New York, couldn't pay the bar bill. I didn't exactly have a lot of personal money to just put on my credit card, right? So it's not like you can just default to. So we ran out of cash. I remember calling Michael and I was like, emergency meeting, everybody drop in 10 to 15K. Like, wow, like, not even our staff wouldn't know that occurred, right? Where we were just down to the absolute. Well, it doesn't mean we weren't being successful. It just means that we're probably waiting for a fundraise. It's like a 2-week delay or something. You know what it's like. It's like cash flow is like a real challenge. Like it's as a real challenge. So anyway, and there's lots of really epic stories of like just all the things that you might expect to happen in a startup that no one talks about, and those all happen to us. So, and I think that obviously all of that will happen today. Like, there's no way that still isn't happening. So,
probably not the run out of money thing, given financial situation of both you and Mike.
Exactly.
But all the others probably as well.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Parting question for you, Keith, is the alternate universe career question. So there's another Keith. He's living in a parallel universe somewhere. He's got a deeply satisfying career. It's not being the startup guy.
Yeah.
What is that career?
To be honest with you, it's if I think back what I was doing before, it's kind of like head of sales or VP of sales of tech companies in the region. I would argue that's probably exactly what I'd be doing.
Right.
I'd probably be like the VP of sales for Salesforce, not Salesforce, but I'm just giving you an example. Could be some tech company from the US coming into the region. That would be it, probably. Or like, that would have been my career path. So the way I looked at life, that wasn't so the way I actually described my career to people as a dual track career, where I was always trying to be entrepreneur, but just never cracked the code, or eventually did. But the other path was just to grow through that classic sales leadership function.
Keith, wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate all of your insights, your energy. Such an energetic and intense guy. I can see why you've ended up in this place in the world and why it's so suitable for you. And I look forward to following the journey of Clarion.
And thank you very much. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Keith.
Cheers, John.
If you enjoy these episodes, I hope you do. I love filming them, and the guests always say what a great and often cathartic experience it is for them. Then please do like and share. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm open to connect requests, and occasionally I get emails from people as well asking me about my experience around certain subjects. So please do like and share and continue to follow the show. I really appreciate your ears.